Your life, you can start. Your life, you can start.
Okay, is everybody in?
Yep. Oh, sorry. Now everybody's in.
Okay, maybe, yeah, others are joining as well. But I'm assuming most of the people are going to watch online instead of zooming in.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can start now. So welcome to tonight's seminar by Jonathan Fardy, which is dedicated to a topic that's basically examination of how we think Marx after Laruelle and his the appearance of his non-philosophical reading of Marx and the possibilities, conceptual, intellectual possibilities, political possibilities that it prefers. It's based on what I know about his latest book, to be out or already out with Bloomsbury Academic. It should be an exciting and very interesting talk. Before I introduce Jonathan, I should say a couple of words about the school. So the School of Materialist Research is an informal graduate and postdoc level program that offers seminars and workshops that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. SMR is an international platform founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at the Arizona State University, Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities, Skopje, Department of Architecture, Theory and Philosophy of Techniques at the Technical University of Vienna, which in cooperation with the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven, functions as a global online school combining education, research, and mentorship to advanced academic study at the intersection of the social sciences and humanities and the STEM sciences. All that we have offered thus far, and we hope to be able to offer in the greatest possible extent, feasible extent, will be open to everybody and free of charge as much as possible within the limits of our, possibilities and resources. So that's the aim. Now, moving on to present Jonathan. So Dr. and Professor Jonathan Fardy is Assistant Professor of Art History and Director of the Graduate Program in Art at Idaho State University. He also holds a joint appointment in the Department of History at the same university. His research focuses on the intellectual history of art, politics, and critical theory. He is the author of 4 books: Laruelle and Non-Photography, 2018, Laruelle and Art, The Aesthetics of Non-Philosophy, 2020, Althusser and Art, 2020, and The Real is Radical, Marx After Laruelle, 2021. His articles have appeared in Postmodern Culture, Angelaki, the Journal of Theoretical Humanities, Postcolonial Text, and elsewhere. So after this brief introduction of both the school and Jonathan and his work, I give the floor to Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Katerina, for that introduction. And it's an honor for me to be here and part of this initiative. And thank you to Zach for helping to facilitate communication. I'm going to read a truncated section from the second chapter of the book that's coming out, as Katerina noted. It's going to come out in September, I think. The Real is Radical, Marx After Laruelle. And the second chapter focuses on Marx and specifically on the concept of disalienation, or I think a better translation is estrangement, and then how I think we can connect that to certain concepts of the stranger in Laruelle to give a kind of foundation, or at least give a opening to something like a stranger Marxism. So stranger is sort of the hinge term. One other point of, I should also say that the book tries to put into dialogue, tries to put Laruelle's non-standard or non-Marxist work into dialogue with a number of thinkers, including Katarina's important work, but also Adorno and Baudrillard and Althusser and Tronti and many others. In an effort both to sort of chart where the affinities, but also importantly the divergences are. A second major thrust of the book, I think, is that I try to put some flesh on a very skeletal idea, at least in my view, a skeletal idea in Laruelle, namely his contention that there's a symmetry between what he calls the philosophy form and the capital form. And this is gestured to in Introduction to Non-Marxism and to some extent in Struggle and Utopia. In my work, I tried to think about how we might bridge this capital form, philosophy form symmetry, or find some conceptual bridge work. And I do that through maybe thinking about the way in which we might understand those two forms as bridgeable by what I might call the intertwined logics of exchange and equivalence. So to put it schematically, we might say that in standard philosophy, at least for Laruelle, if standard philosophy defines it as a decision on the real, that's a conceptual decision in which sort of concepts are effectively traded, if you like, for the real. We understand they're different, but we understand under broad concepts of adequation that there's some exchangeability or equivalential dimension. And of course, this equivalence and exchangeability is, of course, a fundament of capital. So I say that because you'll see some areas in this talk where I touch on this idea of this conceptual bridge of equivalence and exchangeability between philosophy and capital. Okay, but without further ado. So this presentation, again, is going to focus on estrangement in Marx and its relationship to a stranger Marxism in Laruelle. This non-Marxist or non-standard Marxist perspective is established in the name of what Laruelle, building on Michel Henry, identifies as the ordinary or generic individual, who is said to be irreducible to the abstractions of philosophy and capital. So you're going to see quite a bit about this question of the individual and how we might rethink that as well. For Laruelle, we know that philosophy understands itself as self-sufficient. Its self-understanding is that it possesses all the necessary resources with which to render a judgment on what counts as thought and what is real. As John Malarca has written, and I quote, "Such a self-promoting thought is not tethered to certain names or historical disciplines. Philosophy isn't just a set of names or a set of philosophical practices." He continues, "Philosophy is a vector in thought rather than in a universally acknowledged content, one that gives itself sovereign power of thought over all others, whether they be philosophers or non-philosophers." That's the end of his quotation. I think that's really important because it lets us, I think it reflects something true about Laruelle's work, which is that philosophy isn't just, of course, when he says philosophy, he doesn't just mean the academic discipline. He means a way of thinking that, among other things, arrogates power, into sort of intellectual power to subjugate other forms of knowledge. I'm reminded of what William James, the pragmatist William James, once noted in his lectures on pragmatism of 1907. He writes there, "Philosophy is at once the most sublime and most trivial of human pursuits," end quote. For James, philosophy is a state of mind, or as he put it, a temperament, or in Laruelle's terms, perhaps we could call it a posture in thought. One might, for example, adopt the posture of the materialist of the bank, the idealist in matters political, or perhaps to religiously minded in moments of existential dread. There's many other postures we could talk about. And one might all do this all in a single day. Philosophies for James are something we inhabit in different ways at different times. And James readily concedes, however, that no philosopher is likely to admit this, at least not in 1907, because it would have had the effect of reducing the grandeur of philosophy to contingently inhabited moods or postures or states of mind, which is precisely the claim that James will make in those lectures. But if one does admit to it, or at least is open to it, as James and Laruelle do, admittedly in different ways, then one begins to see the whole of philosophy, even academic philosophy, very differently. Now, in terms of the non-philosophical posture, I think we first can say that it firstly takes philosophy as a physical process. And this is something I've really learned not only from Laruelle, but from Katarina's work as well. The importance of thinking philosophy as a physical process, I think, is really important. Non-philosophy in all its forms, including, of course, non-Marxism, is committed to the radical thesis that philosophy not only has a material basis, that's clear in Marx, but that, of course, it's also a physical practice made by thinking bodies. And that is why I think, in part, the early, quote-unquote, early Marx, as I know that Katarina and I would agree, rejects the kind of Althusserian thesis of the epistemological break. The early Marxists become quite important, I think, in the development of non-standard Marxism. The early Marx mounted a series of arguments against philosophical abstraction and estrangement in the name of the physical, the sensual, and in the name of activity. It is to this concept now of estrangement in Marx and to the stranger in Laruelle that I turn in an effort to elucidate his stranger Marxism. Marx was somewhat a stranger in the fields in which he worked. Of course, he drew on recent German philosophy, Hegel, but he also, of course, rejected the assumptions of the idealist tradition. He, of course, also drew on classical political economy, but we know, of course, he rejected the assumptions, their assumptions, particularly about the fairness of the market, among many other things. He also criticized them for their abstraction. As Laruelle notes, and I quote, Marx used philosophy without being, and he puts this next phrase in parentheses, entirely and spontaneously a philosopher. He used science without being entirely and spontaneously a scientist. Neither idealism nor positivism, but two paths that form only one. In an imminent manner, through an identity of which we will say that it is cloned by the real, end quote. We should pause to note the parenthetical phrase entirely and spontaneously, as it is key to Laruelle's point, I believe. Marx was not entirely or spontaneously a philosopher or a scientist. Indeed, he remained critically estranged from the then dominant worldviews circumscribed by each discipline, namely positivistic science and idealist philosophy. And of course, for Marx, we would never think of philosophy in general. You always have to think about philosophy or science as historically situated, otherwise it's kind of abstraction. To remain critically estranged in a state of self-imposed disciplinary exile was Marx's ethical task. Only from this point of view could Marx enter the terrains of philosophy and science without simplistically subordinating his thought to their authority. Marx worked within philosophy and science while submitting to what Paul Silva calls the diktat of the real. Marx critiqued philosophy and modern science ultimately for their failure to capture the physical complexities of reality and their effects in the political sphere. In this sense, his work was conditioned or cloned by the real, to put the matter in Laruelle's terms. And here I'll just sketch a little bit about this concept of the clone. Clone is the name of philosophical material, to some extent transformed in light of the axiom, in light of Laruelle's axiom of the foreclosure of the real to philosophical decision. Philosophical material axiomatically voided of the power to decide the real is transcendental, a la Homelarca, insofar as it transcends the limits of philosophical decisionism. It's transcendental only in that regard. Cloned material looks like philosophy, and that's why it's a good term. It sort of looks like philosophy, like a clone does, but it has its own identity, which is radically opposed to the philosophical tradition or the standard tradition. Precisely, however, in that radical estrangement, it also negatively mimics or clones the real's indifference to thought. So the non-philosophy is indifferent to the real, to mimic the real's indifference to thought. Laruelle's prose can be quite tortured, my personal view, at times, but I think this is because he works assiduously against the pull of philosophical decision, which is easy to fall into. And this requires relentless scrutiny of rhetoric and syntax in order to theoretically ensure that his work remains estranged from the lures and traps of philosophical decisionism, and therefore faithful, in his view, to the radicality of the real. Okay, with this brief setup, let me just touch on estrangement. Marx's concept of estrangement, articulated importantly in the 1844 manuscripts, has generated much debate and contestation. Althusser's work, which has been, I think, important for Laruelle's, famously rejected the concept of estrangement as, quote, ideological, on the grounds that he thought it was derived from a conception of man's essence that he felt formed the keystone of modern bourgeois philosophy. He thought that estrangement was a sort of remnant of Marx's imprisonment within bourgeois philosophy, or the early Marxism. But Althusser's sweeping indictment of the early Marx appears far more equivocal in the one major essay he devotes to 1844 manuscripts. He speaks a lot about the 1844 manuscripts. He actually doesn't address it directly in a major way, except in one essay. Allow me to quote then Althusser at length, and I want to sort of note this sort of uncertainty, I think, in Althusser's own judgment. Althusser writes, and I quote, "One day we shall have to study this text, 1844 manuscripts, in detail and give a word-by-word explanation of it, a reading. Discuss the theoretical status and theoretical role assigned to the key concept of alienated or estranged labor, examine this notion's conceptual field, and recognize that it does fill the role Marx then assigned it, the role of an original basis for the critique of political economy, but also that it can only fill this role so long as it receives it as a mandate and commission from a whole conception of man, which can derive from the essence of man." And then he continues, "In short, we shall have to discover beneath these terms, estrangement, a future meaning, the meaning that still keeps them prisoners of a philosophy that is exercising its last prestige and power over them." So what's interesting to me is that the way in which he renders a judgment here without actually doing the reading. He says, one day we will have to read, but he actually just does the judgment without the reading. The above passage perhaps is symptomatically marked by Althusser's anti-humanist reading of Marx. What is signified in these words is Althusser's emergent critique of the humanist perspective. But why did Althusser postpone the act of reading 1844 manuscripts without postponing judgment on this text? Is this symptomatic of Althusser's rush to secure Marx's name for the Althusserian cause? Perhaps now it's the time to read. I want to focus on two passages from 1844 manuscripts where the thematic of estrangement presents itself, I think, most acutely at both the economic and philosophic levels. Marx writes, and I quote, "The devaluation of the world of men, persons, is in direct proportion to the increasing value of the world of things. Labor produces not only commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity. And this at the same rate as that which it produces commodities in general. This fact expresses merely that the object which labor produces, labor's product, confronts itself as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. The product of labor is labor which has been embodied in an object, which has become material. It is," he italicizes this, "it is the objectification of labor. Under these economic conditions," he continues, "this realization of labor appears as loss of realization for the workers, manifestation of the object, loss of realization for the worker, for the worker's objectification as loss of the object and bondage to it." So estrangement from the object and bondage to that very estrangement. Appropriation as estrangement, end quote. The devaluation of man or persons is in direct proportion to the increasing value of commodities. So value is drained from the worker's work and is realized in the value of commodities produced. All this is very elementary. Workers are thereby held in bondage to the decreasing value of their work and increasingly estranged from the value realized by commodities in the market. There's held in bondage to this problem. Marx writes that this estrangement, this is the second quote, that, quote, this estrangement is manifested not only in the result, not only in the object produced, but within the producing activity itself. And this is an important theme, of course, in the early Marx, which is this notion of the importance of activity. It's not just in the object. He says the thesis on Feuerbach. The problem with Feuerbach is it's either you're concerned about the material object or the material of contemplation, but there's no concern, he thinks, taken for activity, what's happening in action. How could the worker, this is Marx continuing, how could the worker come to face the product of his activity, her activity, as a stranger, were it not that in the very act of production, he was estranging himself from himself, end quote. It is the very act of producing commodities that, for Marx, produces the worker as stranger to themselves. What emerges in the act of commodity production is a self that is stranger to the self as worker. The estranged self, repelled, expelled, exiled, produced out of the reflux of commodified labor, negatively indexes a certain kind of individuality, in quotes, which cannot be easily assimilated into the very rigors and discipline of work which produced it. And we know this too well. We feel it not only in the exhaustion from work, but in the exhaustion with work itself. Tired of work. As noted, Althusser and his students pilloried the early Marxist ideological reliance on this concept of estrangement. Others in the 1960s, however, took a very different view, including Michel Henry, whose work has also been important for Laruelle. This is Henry sort of responding to Althusser. He says, quote, Marx has indeed abandoned the concept of the essence of man, not after his early writings, but in these very early writings. The entire fundamental philosophical problem of the early Marx is precisely this rejection of the essence of man, the essence of the species. However, Marx's problematic rejecting of the philosophy of the essence of man does not entail a dismissal of the individual qua real individual, end quote. So Henry tries to salvage a kind of theory of individuality in Marx, not only in the later Marx, but the early Marx, which is estranged from this notion of the essential notions of the human. So Henry responds to Althusser by saying, you know, I agree with you. There's a critique of the essence of any notion of an essentialist humanness, but you're wrong, he says, Althusser, for conflating that with individuality. You're conflating concepts. A new concept of the individual, according to Henry, grounds Marx's consistent critique of essentialist concepts of the human. Marx, according to Henry, shows that any attempt to ground the human on concepts derived from biology, psychology, sociology, and so forth, fails to capture in its concepts what he claims radically resists every such philosophical generalization, what Henry describes as, quote, the most radical and most particular determination, the individual. Skipping a bit, I want to pick up this notion of the individual and see how Laruelle develops it. In my view, Laruelle clones, in a sense, Henry's insight into what he terms the finite individual. This is in Biography of Ordinary Man. The concept of the finite individual is explored in depth in the book as a whole, but here I just want to say that by finite individual, I take it that Laruelle means that the most ordinary, his terms, or generic, his term as well, reality of being human cannot be fully captured or assimilated by any philosophical theory of humanism, or anti-humanism, or post-humanism. These isms are infinite schemes of the philosophical imagination. They've been endlessly iterated. The human can be endlessly philosophized, but the real human, the human in the real, in Laruelle's terms, is not a philosophical concept. Hence, for Laruelle, a science of the human, as against the human sciences or humanities, should take as its point of departure the negative kernel at the heart of infinitized schemes of speculation on the human. The science of the human is a radical description of the lived experience of humanists, or what Laruelle calls a biography of ordinary man. And he writes from that book, and I quote, "This is the meaning of biography of ordinary man, a rigorous description of the most general experiences that govern the relation of individuals as such to history, to the state, to economy, to language, etc. The text of this science is thus no longer the cogito and its membra disjecta, which the human sciences divide among themselves. It is this irreducible kernel that must be extracted, end quote. Laruelle draws on Marx's concept of estrangement, but he radicalizes it. For Laruelle, one is not a worker, a citizen, an economic unit of value, nor finally even a philosophical subject, not even the subject of Marxist philosophy or revolutionary praxis. The finite individual is stranger to all these and stranger than all these. We are, for Laruelle, strangers to what he calls super-capitalist abstraction, sort of philosophy plus capital, in the last instance, and thus permanently estranged and exiled from the familiar terrains encompassed by philosophies of the subject or the human. The problem then for non-standard Marxism is to render Marxism strange, and in particular estranged from this philosophical tradition of the human, without, however, divorcing it from this concept of the individual, the finite individual that he wants to salvage. How then is this to be accomplished? Here, we must now return again to Marx. And this section is called Marx's Sojourn in Philosophy. That's a line taken from George Lebicka's book, a wonderful book called Marxism and the Status of Philosophy. Marx traversed through philosophy to expose its ideological basis. We see this very clearly in German Ideology, Theses on Feuerbach, 1844 manuscripts. In the German Ideology, for example, Marx and Engels critiqued the ideology of German criticism, Kant to the young Hegelians, and I quote, "German criticism has right up to its latest efforts," writes Marx and Engels, "never quitted the realm of philosophy," end quote. Marx repudiated the idealist tradition, of course, for spiriting away historical reality. Marx did, however, give passing marks to Feuerbach for his historicization of religious doctrine. But the efforts of this young Hegelian, of course, did not go far enough. Now, Marx's most biting attack on Feuerbach, of course, was aimed at the latter's materialism in his famed Theses on Feuerbach, which was not published, of course, in his lifetime. There, of course, Marx indicts philosophical materialism, and here I must say that Katerina's work has also been extremely important for me, thinking this distinction, philosophical materialism, different than material. The other thing I think is interesting in the Thesis on Feuerbach is the form, which is that he says, and this is something else Katerina I think has drawn a lot of attention to, is he says, the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included. So Feuerbach becomes a kind of allegory for a problem deep within materialist philosophy. He's a figure, a kind of cipher for that problem. The chief defect of all philosophy is that, quote, the object reality, what we apprehend through our senses, this is Marx, is understood only in the form of the object or contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, end quote. What philosophical materialism conceptualizes as reality is only ever this object or contemplation. They ask questions like, what is an object composed of? What are its fundaments? Or what's the relationship between my thought and that object? But the problem for Marx is that that's a static model of a static model of materiality that flies in the face of historical movement. Philosophical materialism for Marx cannot grasp sensuous human activity, because while this can be converted into concepts, it is what Adorno might have called non-conceptual in the last instance. Marx's blunt refusal of philosophy in the last instance and the gesture towards a non-philosophical, in Marx's sense, outside, makes philosophers uncomfortable. And there's a lot of literature sort of trying to, even in Henri, trying to kind of show how somehow Marx's early critique of philosophy is really still not exactly a critique of philosophy. Etienne Balibar, for one, in his Philosophy of Marx, argues that Marx's repudiation of philosophy in Theses on Feuerbach is equivocal at best. And this is Balibar. He writes, quote, Theses on Feuerbach demand a definitive exit, Ausgang, from philosophy. But the difficulties begin at precisely this point. There can be no doubt that Marx never ventured to publish a call for such an exit, or did not find an opportunity to do so. And yet he wrote it. And like a purloined letter, it has come down to us, end quote. So I think Balibar is quite equivocal there. The sense is that, well, we shouldn't take it too seriously because he didn't publish it in his lifetime. But on the other hand, it's come down to us. So there's a kind of ambivalence here about what we're to do with this very strident rejection of to some extent, of all materialism. Well, I think Balibar sets us on an interesting path. I think that Georges Labika really goes the distance. And it's to his work I want to turn for a moment. Labika argues that Marx's sojourn in philosophy, his terms, must be understood in the social context of the dominance of German criticism. Marx could not simply exit philosophy in the first or perhaps even the last instance because, historically speaking, he was forced to think through philosophy, as philosophy was the horizon in which social and political questions were posed at that time. It's where one had to go. To understand Marx, according to Labika, it's necessary to understand quote, the necessity of the sojourn in philosophy, unquote. A necessity, he continues, which was in fact uniquely imperative in Germany, which was in fact a property of the German situation of philosophy, in which philosophy, or in more general terms, theoretical reflection, seemed to constitute the sole available medium for social criticism, end quote. So Labika's argument is that the sojourn in philosophy was a kind of historical necessity, that one which Marx was actually trying to push against. Marx's work, especially German ideology, Theses on Feuerbach, and the poverty of philosophy, are testaments, I think, to this necessity of the sojourn in philosophy. I would argue that the ideology that is challenged in these texts, among other things, is precisely the ideological assumption that the reigning philosophy of the day was sufficient to accomplish a meaningful critique of ideology, precisely because that philosophy was ideological in the last instance. Labika writes, and I quote, "It was the merit of Marx to recognize and show that behind the relation philosophy and the world was hidden another alternative, this question that consumed Hegelian thought, world and thought, was hidden another alternative which invoked the first and held it up to comparison in order to lay bare the conditions of its possibility and to ask it precisely the question of its questions. Namely, was this relation, philosophy of the world, however conceived, to remain forever internal to philosophy, or did its very presence reveal an outer world which, unbeknown to philosophy, was philosophy's presupposition," end quote. And so, in my reading, at least of Labika, I can see a sort of non-philosophical orientation emerging there, the sense that he argues that Marx is really working through philosophy in order to index something that is absent in that philosophy, namely a kind of fidelity to the real. Labika's insight, I think, is profound. The question that Marx put to philosophy is, in his words, the question of its questions. Is the relation between philosophy and the world a question that has to be asked forever and always within philosophy? You know, is it always just circumscribed by the philosophical field? As a note, I might say too, I think there's some interesting affinities here with Derrida's notion of the philosophy's other. Can you think about a philosophy's other without turning it into a philosophical other? Or, and this is Labika's vision, does the very presence of the problem within philosophy presuppose something non-philosophical in the last instance? Listen to these words by Labika, and I think you can hear a bit of some kind of proto-Laruellian thought here. And Labika writes, quote, "The real, this was the starting point of Marx's quest. But this real had nothing to do with any empirical given. It was not to be arrived at by placing in opposition the forms of existence to which philosophical ideas were inadequate, not in the philosophy-world relation. It designated the inner emptiness of the philosophical ideas themselves and the arbitrary character of the systems into which they could be organized." End quote. Now, Laruelle, for his part, and this is, I know, a bit of a jump, but I just want to put that sort of Labika in the background. Laruelle, for his part, is, I think, less concerned with adjudicating the question of which philosophies are present where and when in Marx's trajectory than in extending Marx's combat against the reign of philosophical abstraction. It is, of course, the primacy of the real that governs Laruelle's approach to the Marxist tradition. Every effort is made by Laruelle to resist the lure of deciding philosophically on Marx in the name of collating his raw materials to develop in theoretical resistance to abstraction. This takes the form of a radically immanent way of thinking and writing that seeks to formally resist the decisionist dialectic by which the real enters into a conceptual economy of exchange with philosophy. Get outside this economy of philosophy world exchange. Now, the way that I try to sort of think about this is that he tries to put philosophy and the question of the world into what he calls a matrix, and sort of suspend its decisional decisional posture, and then to examine this relationship as material rather than as sort of having epistemological or epistemic warrant. He wants to sort of look at this problem as a material problem and not to think, gee, which side of the, what's the right philosophical answer? I mean, it's interesting. He sort of takes philosophical decisions as material and then examines what were the conditions for the production of such a material. Now, this non-philosophical matrix is established on the basis of two principal axioms for Laruelle: the foreclosure of the real to philosophy or philosophical reason, and correspondingly the insufficiency of standard philosophy with respect to the real. Now, beyond this axiomatic standpoint, much of non-philosophy, including on standard Marxist philosophy, can be described not as a doctrine, but a doing. Laruelle writes, quote, "The matrix of non-philosophy is a speaking, thinking according to the one." Of course, if you know, many of you do, Laruelle's insistence that the real is one, but that's not a one that's countable under monism or other philosophical doctrines of unity. To speak, think according to the one is to syntactically, rhetorically, as well as conceptually compose, actually write material in such a way that concepts are presented as physical materials immanent to the real. But much of this cannot be done in any other way, it seems, than by highly stylized and formal means that can make reading Laruelle somewhat difficult. But non-Marxist philosophy and non-philosophy generally does not mean a rejection of philosophical materials. And this is something Laruelle insists again and again. I always find that when talking to people who are new to Laruelle, they say, why is he rejecting philosophy? He doesn't. He rejects this decisionist posture. One can only think according to the real by thinking according to the force of its foreclosure. And you have to do this effectively through philosophical concepts. To work then in the non-standard Marxist register requires, I believe, critical decisions both about how to approach Marxism and how to rewrite its philosophical syntax. The non-Marxist decision, notes Laruelle, is a transformation of the thought world of Marxist philosophy into a thought according to the stranger subject, end quote. This transformation of the thought world of Marxism, and this is Laruelle continuing, excludes the idea of an intervention within the world conceived in terms of the philosophical world. It's not an intervention in the philosophical world. It excludes any sense of intervention in that it excludes any philosophically oriented venture into the world understood by Laruelle as the hallucinated name for the real constantly invoked by philosophers. Non-Marxism does not intervene in the world of philosophy, the world envisioned by philosophy. It intervenes in the material world given to us by philosophical materials. To take an abrupt turn towards my conclusion, I want to turn back to this question of an exit from philosophy, an Ausgang, by posing the possibility that the exit from philosophy after Laruelle might be best described, or possibly described, as an exit door or an entry door to aesthetics. And this might seem like a strange answer, and because we're used to thinking of aesthetics as a philosophical discipline. But as I've tried to argue elsewhere, Laruelle proposes not an aesthetics to be decided by non-philosophy, but actually an immanent aesthetics of writing non-philosophy as a practice, a syntactical practice. Again, as Omalarka writes, and I quote, "For Laruelle, the establishment of a radically immanent philosophy, one which escapes transcendence, cannot be achieved in and through traditional philosophy at all. It can only be instituted through a non-philosophical thought whose subject matter is the history of philosophy itself. This non-philosophy will thus appear similar to philosophy but only because its raw material is traditional philosophy. So it's a working on philosophy. Non-philosophy is thus, he notes, Omalarka notes, is not just a theory, but a practice. He continues, it rewrites or redescribes particular philosophies, but in a transcendental way, end quote. Non-philosophical writing rigorously and scrupulously avoids the decisionist imperatives of standard philosophy and cancels the operativity of the standard philosophical economy of thought, which presumes that concepts can somehow be traded for the real under broad notions of adequation or equivalence. The turn to aesthetics here, I think, is in fact a turn towards the materiality of philosophical materials and to a conception of non-philosophy as a sensuous activity of making. I do not, however, mean to suggest that non-Marxism is mere wordplay. It's not. But it is surely a matter of words, and it is a matter of making with verbal materials a rigorous thought that is non-philosophical in the last instance. Non-Marxism is indeed a stranger subject, therefore, stranger than we have known from philosophies of Marxism. It is estranged from the decisionist gains of standard philosophy. For Marx, estrangement again names the estranged relation between self and worker. This estrangement is wrought by commodified forms of work, but this moment of estrangement also, patrie ennui, illuminates the radicality of the individual or certain concept of individual as that which cannot be seamlessly integrated into the logic of domination. The moment of non-Marxism then clones and transforms this concept of estrangement to figure in non-figurative terms the stranger subject as the name for a subject who is rightly ill-adapted to the rigors of rationalized labor, but it also names a form or mode of non-philosophical work, of writing, of working with philosophy as raw materials in such a way that estranges them by rendering them strangely unworkable within the standard economy of knowledge production, whereby the real is exchanged for concepts and subordinated to them. The labor of non-Marxist theory maintains and magnifies the estranging dissonance between philosophy and the real. But in its estrangement, strangely, non-Marxism remains faithful to the radicality of the real, precisely insofar as it refuses to do what it axiomatically claims cannot be done, namely to decide that which is always already decisive, the real. And I'll just conclude with this one quote by Laruelle. The non-Marxist practice of Marxism, he writes, is destined to struggle against the particular interests of philosophical systems desperately attempting to capture it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, now the floor is open for discussion. Does anybody want to say something? Okay, I can see one hand raised. Dimitar has a question. Let me just see if anybody else. Jeremy has a. Oh, Dimitar, you lowered your hand. Okay, so Jeremy goes first then. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Jonathan. This was an interesting talk, and I'm very excited to see where your book goes from this chapter that you've read out loud.
Thank you.
I've got a whole load of questions, and some of it is really, I don't mean this to be polemical in tone, but it's striking to me that one of the questions I have while going through this lecture is, what is the point of non-Marxism at this point? And one of the reasons why I ask this is because you frame it as though like it's intelligible in already existing Marxist scholarship, and it doesn't actually show some sort of autonomous, independent, transcendental axiomatic that is only, independent on its own, as a non-Marxism would be, insofar as it's something that cannot be reducible to Marxism. It could use the statements of Marxism in a completely different way. So there's several questions that I have, and it's just one thing that I guess strikes me is this focus on estranged labor. And I'm wondering if you're trying to argue that estranged labor is a symptom of the stranger subject. Because the thing is, with regards to these kinds of terms, there is a philosophical Feuerbachian residue in terms of estranged labor. And if that is the case, how do you reconcile Feuerbach's approach, which is like a sensibilist materialism, with Laruelle's non-philosophy, with Laruelle's non-humanism? Like, how are these completely different? What distinguishes the stranger from the generic man of Feuerbach? And if this is the case, and this is another thing on top of that, because non-Marxism, Introduction to Non-Marxism is a very conjunctural text. Like, it's dealing with a specific way of dealing with Marxism, which is the failure of it to carry out its critique of capitalism, that it has philosophical concepts of capital, philosophical concepts of science, philosophical concepts of the human, so on and so forth. So, like, how does your talk with regards to this conjuncture of Introduction to Non-Marxism deal with, let's say, Marx's critique of political economy, where exploitation has both a critique of it in terms of the French socialist tradition, on the one hand, and the critique of the economic legal term of exploitation of land, for instance. So this is a broad, like, overarching question that I'm curious to see how, if non-Marxism actually has a point to it, if this is going to just be a repetition of the same things that happened prior. That's my question.
I appreciate that, Jeremy, and thank you for coming. I think that I should say that I try to, in the larger book, which I can leave to others' judgment to see how I've done this, I've tried to always, where possible, to try to chart the divergences and, or as you call it, the autonomy of non-standard philosophy, in this specific case, non-standard Marxism. At the same time, I do also think that one can take it too far in the other direction, which is to imagine somehow that non-standard philosophy is somehow, radically separated. I guess I don't believe that it's radically autonomous, precisely because I believe, let's take Laruelle at his word, that the material of non-standard philosophy is precisely philosophical material. It's a different way of working with it. And so in that regard, I find it useful to try to chart or locate where the kind of materiality in the work, where's it coming from? It's non-standard Marxism, so it names a field, right? So the question is that, for me, is that I think we have to kind of engage the materiality that comprises his own work. Even though, of course, there's in many ways in which he doesn't exactly cite these things, or he doesn't index it in the standard academic way. And I respect that move, but I do think that it would be also strange, but it would be strange to entirely differentiate the project from the materiality of which it's composed. Now, you mentioned Feuerbach, and I couldn't quite reformulate exactly what you said on that point, but suffice to say, the estrangement in Marx is a sort of production that comes from the producing activity itself, according to his own statement. And I believe that his chief argument with Feuerbach in the thesis on Feuerbach, among other things, is precisely he doesn't seem to recognize that this genericity, this generic man, human, that is not foundational, but it's emergent precisely out of a process of estranged, exploited labor. And that's I think, a quite different view than Feuerbach's. So as far as the differences between the material I cited and non-standard Marxism, I think they're profound insofar as I think that non-standard Marxism, as it's presented, at least in the introduction book, and to some extent, I think in Struggle and Utopia, and of course, gestured to, I think, throughout in different ways, I think what's uniquely different is somehow how it, and perhaps we're going to be different here, is I think it's sort of uber theoretical in some sense. It's very much committed to working through these materials, but not in the kind of standard academic disquisition, having arguments with philosophers, but it is a working with these materials. It doesn't seem to be, at least in my reading, offering any sort of recipes about what to do beyond that. Now, I would argue that, for frankly, Katerina and others have gestured ways in which we might really, think about a kind of political practice that can be mounted out of this work. But in the texts themselves, it seems to me that the questions around struggle and Marxism have to do with the struggle with the philosophical materials themselves and the consequences that those materials have had on political thought and action, without, however, sort of leading us into some kind of set of, or gesturing to a set of recipes about what to do. And I do think that what I would say is that that's also different in that he's not engaging questions like, is Marx right about this or wrong about that? Which side of the Marxist debate has got this right or wrong? I mean, he doesn't really do that. What he does is tries to sort of engage this material and ask, what would it mean to labor as a non-standard philosopher with these materials? The kind of production, I think, of the let's say not the position of philosopher, the position of a thinker, as a kind of worker of materials, rather than a decider of the real or arrogating intellectual power.
Jeremy, do you have any further comment to this?
Nope. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, I'll give the floor to Amanda. I just want to build on Jeremy's comment and add a question to it. I think that now I'm putting myself in the position of interpreting Jeremy's question and guessing where it was supposed to lead to. But okay, let's put it this way. I was inspired by Jeremy to ask you the following, because not many of the present here in the Zoom class, as well as on the online stream, are very familiar with non-Marxism. It might be, of pedagogical use to explain what kind of Marxism do we arrive at by employing Laruelle's method. So, for example, one of the things that he proposes in the introduction to non-Marxism is to read Marxism of philosophical tenets in its legacy. So the entire legacy of Marxism itself, not Marxist texts only per se, but also Marxist texts too ought to be read in a different way. Thus, we have to evacuate the concept of dialectical materialism as a properly philosophical concept that is borrowed from Hegel. And in that way, we are closer to the original project of Marx, which is doing sort of, or creating a science of species being, of humanity and social relations that is indebted to philosophy, but isn't philosophy nonetheless. So in my case, departing from here, Laruelle has helped me to elucidate some writings by Marx, where I can see very clearly his attack, I would say, on Hegel, his problem with Hegel, and the inextricability of Hegel's idealism, or any sort of idealism, from philosophy itself. Then, if you go further and into a closer reading of these texts of Marx himself, and I have arrived to this text and taken this path of reading thanks to Laruelle, one realizes that according to Marx, we are stuck in idealism, always already stuck in idealism by accepting subjectivity, so anthropocentrism, as the governing principle of thought. So he proposes, this third party's perspective and, a form of, a way of thinking objectively without positivist objectivism. So by explaining this, my personal experience of the use of non-Marxism I have made, I'm trying to illustrate that, very concrete things can be done thanks to Laruelle with Marx, which are radically different from the tradition of Marxism we have known, and maybe closest to Althusser's use of Marxism, in spite of the disagreements around the epistemological break, etc., even though even in Althusser this is not an argument against humanism, it's more against philosophical humanism, which again makes Althusser really close to rather close, surprisingly close to Laruelle's reading of Marx. So maybe you can expound a little bit more on this so that, the audience grasps what's the use of non-Marxism and the theory of Marxism, of contemporary Marxism. Jeremy, I don't know if I'm asking a question which is along the lines of what you tried to tackle as a problem, but...
Is this something for me to answer, Katerina?
No, but no.
Okay, but yes.
I'm just curious if this is more or less what you were asking as well, or similar. So that
similar.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There might be a slight lag from my end due to internet connection. But yes, this definitely shares some insights to what I was asking, and to just clarify on these kinds of approaches. And more importantly, just to situate what Laruelle is saying in Introduction to Non-Marxism on a broader conjunctural setting, which is what is concerned with.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Jonathan, okay, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Katerina, for that, and Jeremy as well. Again, I think so. Yeah, let me try to situate it more broadly, and probably should have done this at the beginning. But perhaps first, it's best to say that non-standard philosophy, what sort of generally is happening there, and then how this kind of gets worked out in the introduction to non-standard Marxism. So, in many things to say, but one of the things is that non-standard philosophy, or Laruelle's work, is based on this idea, and this gets to I think an argument he has with dialectical philosophy in general, including dialectical materialism, is that philosophy presumes it can sort of enter into some kind of conceptual exchangeability with the real, that it somehow is operating this way. And of course, in Laruelle's work, he axiomatically stipulates that this is not the case, that the real is primary, and that's of course not new, that's in much of, there's a lot of Marxism, but for him, it's unilateral duality, meaning that the real determines the possibility for thought, including philosophical thought. But philosophy then responds and thinks that it can sort of enter into a sort of dialogue with the real, a conceptual dialogue, or economy of thought with the real. And this, he thinks, is an hallucination of philosophy. The real determines thought, or it conditions the possibility of thought, but it doesn't, it only operates in one direction. So it's unilateral duality. So there's two sides of the coin. There's philosophy, there's the real and philosophy, but they're not in some dialectical or otherwise interchangeable communication or dialectic. It's not the real determines thought, and one of the effects of that is precisely to give rise to a standard philosophical belief that it can then sort of has the sufficient resources, conceptual resources, to make a decision about what the real is at its most fundamental, or what's really important, and that he rejects. And how that gets translated into non-standard Marxism is that I think he thinks one of the failures, and Jeremy's right, that one of the major thrusts of the book is to deal with the legacy of failure, both the reality of that, but also the kind of right-wing rhetoric about the failures of Marxism. And it is responding to this real and rhetorical notion of failure in Marxism. But he indicts it, but his response is that that failure can be traced really to a kind of philosophical, to the ways in which Marxism is still haunted, he thinks, by philosophical posture. This decisional posture with respect to the real. What he wants to do, although I don't think he really lays out how it to be done, but he leaves us with some frameworks to maybe think about this, is that he wants to remodel thought in, what do you say, remodel thought as cloned by the real, is to somehow actually capture in thought the reality of this sort of always prior conditioning of the real. And not, he thinks, to pull this sort of philosophical move, which is to arrogate kind of power to itself in this decisional way that says, philosophy has sufficient resources to make these kind of grand decisions about the real, whether that be in epistemological terms or political terms or what have you. And that means that the orientation of the book is fundamentally different, he would say, I think, fundamentally different than standard philosophical Marxism. And so it's one of the interesting things, too, he does in the beginning of the book, is he says that in light of this both real and rhetorical notion of failure, he says the question now, and he's sort of ventriloquizing a bit of Lenin, is what is to be done with Marxism? Mm-hmm. What is to be done with Marxism? And responding to this philosophical lineage, which he thinks has been problematic for developing a kind of thought that then might be marshaled into some kind of actual political practice, but not in the forms that he thought that had failed because he thought they were guided by sort of philosophical arrogance.
Mm-hmm. So he basically, this approach opens up the possibility for, envisaging, refashioning or fashioning a new kind of political praxis based on Marx. So let's say 4 by 11 pieces is rendered, doable. Okay. Yeah. Now I give the floor to Amanda, and then we have another question in the chat.
Hi, thanks very much. I just wondered if you could expand a little bit more on this shift to aesthetics that you brought up at the end of your paper. And I know you didn't go into that in much detail, so I was wondering if I could hear more about it. But the reason I'm asking is also because it's very often that, you know, one turns to aesthetics as a mode to introduce certain forms of freedom or free play or free exchange, as opposed to the equivalence of exchange that you're kind of critiquing, right? So it's a kind of real trope to do that, like with a lot of thinkers, as we know, like, you know, whether I mean, I'm thinking on the one hand, you can go back and think of Schiller, you know, Schillerian aesthetics, you know, this kind of he autonomous space. But on the other hand, you know, I'm also interested in, which maybe comes back to the questions just asked before, which is about method of non-standard thinking, in the sense that, you know, if we are, which we might not be, thinking of aesthetics as an opportunity to think of, let's say, more conditions of free exchange or play, then what does that do to the rigors that you're talking about that are required to think of an objective science, let's say, right? What I'm wondering about is maybe even like how this potential idea of, say, an anti-realist pragmatic attitude that squares with a kind of materialism goes with any notion of aesthetics of freedom, so I see them as kind of contradictory if they are being posited together. And I'm wondering if, you know, how you talked about bridging things earlier, but if that is the case, how is that bridged? But, you know, I might be reading this incorrectly and you might not be thinking in those terms, but I am very interested in what might be called aesthetic reason in this space of aesthetics, because I worry that it will just basically turn non-philosophy or the project of a non-standard rigorous set of thinking into like comp lit, right? Yep. So that's my kind of problem that I'd love you to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. It's a great question. And yeah, you know, and in the broader book, and especially in that last book, at least I tried to suggest that, you know, by aesthetics, I really should say non-standard aesthetics, and Laruelle's use of that term in the book Photo Fiction, and to some extent in the concept of non-photography. Two books that I think are really, in a way, kind of really interesting models for non-standard philosophy. I think they're kind of, they model what non-standard philosophical thought looks like. They do it through the materiality, or the language at least, of photography, particularly, and in photo fiction, it's also through the concept of fiction, or the practice of fictionalizing. Now, to your point, I absolutely agree that there is a trope that sort of aesthetics is the last sort of space of freedom in an administered world. I certainly try. If I failed, we'll see, but I certainly try to resist that trope. You mentioned Schiller, and I think there's a long tradition where, yeah, aesthetics has this idea that it's a place of free play outside of you know, a kind of freedom of the senses, or something apart from otherwise a dominated social domination, political domination, etc. My point of reference too for that kind of trope would also be kind of in my view, the kind of worst aspects of deconstruction, the kind of lot of, you know, playful, in the serious term, the playful book, the playful writing, play as a kind of resistant practice against structure, logic. So I definitely don't want to give too much credence to that. And to your point that it has to be rigorous, I think it does. Rigorous in Laruelle's sense, it has to be rigorous fidelity to his axioms of non-standard philosophy. I mean, non-standard philosophy is in that sense axiomatic. And so by aesthetics, I mean perhaps something even too broad, but I mean a kind of work and practice of the senses. And of course, one of the senses is reading, or the practice of reading. And anyone who's read Laruelle will see that his writing is marked by at times very peculiar syntactical arrangements, literally the arrangement of words, hyphenations all over the place. This arrangement is not done to just be experimental and make philosophy look like writing or something one would study in a college department, but is in fact trying to actually be rigorous to this concept of unilateral duality, the concept of the primacy of the real. So, even things like he wants to think about philosophical material is in the real, it's not on the real, right? There's a lot of sort of work at the syntactical level around how you literally position, in a prepositional sense, position philosophical statements. So by aesthetics, I mean that there is a kind of texture and a look, if you like, to Laruelle's text, but it's not, let me just do wordplay. He's actually trying to construct a kind of philosophical form or philosophical aesthetic that itself at the sort of micro syntactical level of things is actually derived from or faithful to those axioms of the primacy of the real and the insufficiency of thought with respect to it. So how do you kind of think of the real as having the effect on thought and then write out philosophical or non-philosophical material that sort of clones that effect of the real on thought without giving rise to, now let me start making statements about the real and entering into a kind of conceptual economy with the real. How do you keep this sort of one way or unilaterality in the text of the writing itself? So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's an aesthetics, I think, in his work, but it is rigorously determined by his axiom concerning the real and its unilateral effect on thought.
Shall we move on, or do you have some further comment, Amanda? No. Okay. Okay, I'll just go ahead and read the question in the chat. So, thank you so much, Jonathan, for a magnificent presentation. I have a question regarding your use of the term philosophical material. In a few instances, you seem to suggest that this material was physical. Could you please expand on that? It doesn't seem to be an identification made by Laruelle, and at least in his treatises, and strikes me as potentially pinning the material to a philosophical decision for a kind of physicalism, in favor of a kind of physicalism.
So it's a great question. He doesn't, I'm trying to think if he does use that term physical. I mean, he certainly uses this term philosophical material, but at the same time, I want to sort of, and here actually I'm drawing on Katerina's work. I mean, I kind of want to use the term physical, and I'll talk about what I mean by physical here, but I want to use the term physical because the term material is sort of, can be easily kind of bound up with certain philosophies of materialism, which is precisely what he's trying to get away from. And it's also not physicalism, which of course is also a philosophical doctrine. It's, I think, actually something much more, at least in my work, something much more basic, even kind of generic. What I simply mean is that the process of producing thought is, of course, physical. That's brain in action. You get hungry when you do it, so at least I do sometimes. But also that the texts themselves, words on a page, is a physical substrate to this. And so, insisting on that idea of philosophy as a physical process. The other person I draw on here is Anthony Paul Smith. There is a moment in his book, Laruelle, A Stranger Thought, where Smith in discussing this notion of philosophy as physical, philosophical thought as physical, has a really nice example of this, which is that I cite, which is even the physical experience of reading, frankly, like, you know, the exhilaration or the frustration or the indifference that we don't, these practices of working with texts are physical. And so both, of course, the matter of words on the page, but also the process of producing them and of consuming them, I think can all be described very much in physical terms. But I do want to sort of distinguish that from a notion of philosophical physicalism. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's, and I would say also this notion of out of Laruelle too, that, you know, it's non-standard philosophy isn't, in very much a sense, it is a kind of doing, it's a kind of practice, it's about a way of working with philosophical materials. It's quite different, it's a way of working with them in such a way that you affirm always the prior determinative quality of the real. But that actually requires, in just very basic terms, it requires a particular way of writing, it seems, in order so that the actual prose that you're constructing is somehow, is a kind of clone of that condition. In my book, in the second to last chapter is on fiction, the concept of fiction. And this also to go back to Amanda's question. By fiction, Laruelle doesn't just mean sort of making philosophy look like literature. It is a very particular fictionalizing process in which you begin to write out thought in a way that's faithful to this non-dialectical, non-exchangeability of concept for the real. But that does, in effect, give rise to very, at least in Laruelle's case, very particular ways of rhetorically constructing an argument.
If I may add something, I'm sorry to intervene that often, but since you mentioned me, I just want to explain my use of the physical. So it's not derived from Laruelle's work. It's not a Laruellian concept. It's actually something I borrow from Marx when I refer to Marx's texts, because in Marx we find real and physical as synonymous terms. And the explanation for that is that Marx was cautious with regard to the term material in order to avoid confusion with the materialism of, you know, the materialism of the materialist philosophers such as Feuerbach. So in order to distinguish that, he resorts to this term. So there is a reason for this. One must say that when Marx uses the word physical, he does not mean, he does not use it in the vitalist sense. It does not always have to be, you know, a living body. It can be, you know, resources for, you know, economic production. It can be a product, as long as, you know, physical labor, as long as we do not see it and treat it as a commodity, so abstracted from the surplus value. So he uses the word physical as synonymous to the real in this sense, and even though the term materialism appears in Marx's texts, when it comes to the adjective, he usually resorts to these two terms. Whereas the material that Laruelle operates with is always called transcendental material. So it's a mass, hora of concepts. So that's transcendental. One could liken it to, you know, the real abstractions of, you know, Zonretel. So these are two different things. I don't know how Jonathan treats them in his book. I mean, I have read the parts of the manuscript, but I don't have the whole picture. So if he has anything further to add, is more than welcome. I just wanted to clarify my use of the physical and that it's directly linked to Marx. And I'm trying to remain in a certain relationship of fidelity to the original texts of Marx. It has no reference to Laruelle whatsoever.
No, thank you for that.
I don't know if Jonathan has anything to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, yeah, that, I mean, I'm also, I suppose, yeah, interested in this idea of, again, sensuous human activity as also is physical. So it's not, as you noted, it's not, from Marx that it's just has to be, as you said, like a vitalist living body, but it could be the production process. It doesn't have to be organic matter. It's physical, and in that sense, it has a kind of, as Kennedy says, I think, he did want that, as Marx wanted to, find a term that was not so easily conflated with the materialist, philosophical materialist tradition, which he was militating against, trying to kind of find a term that actually would do well to describe organic processes in nature, in the body as well, but also entirely inorganic, artificial, socially, historically constructed processes like the production process, labor, et cetera. So without, however, giving rise to a kind of physicalist doctrine, because that would also, I think, still be too reductive and I suspect sort of ahistorical for Marx as well.
Yeah.
Because physicalism wouldn't be physical. The physical is never, it's never that the physical is one thing. It would have to be, well, how do we understand the physical? How does it work or manifest itself in this moment under these conditions?
Great, thanks a lot. Okay, Lina has to leave. Interesting talk, a great discussion. Her comment. Anybody else? Davor? Yeah, go ahead.
Hello? Does it work? Hello? Okay, it doesn't work.
If you could just speak up. I think you're away from the microphone.
Doesn't seem to work again. Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yes, it works. If you could just speak up a little bit, that would be great.
I'm sorry, I don't have this beautiful microphone like Jonathan. Okay, so look, I have two questions of which I don't know if they make any sense at all, but they're kind of flying through my head, and maybe I'll just ask them. So number one is, I didn't hear the word truth, not a single time in your talk. And I was just curious, is there still something like truth? Because both in Marxism and standard non-Marxism, because I think there must be some notion of truth, because obviously Laruelle is criticizing other philosophers for not being, faithful to the truth or something like this. So there must be a better and a worse. So there must be more truth and less truth. So I was just wondering if you could say something maybe about the concept of truth from this perspective. And then I have another strange thing flying around in my head. Does philosophy, is it somehow maybe directly related to estrangement or, alienation itself? So I'm saying that because, this famous quote of Marx, today you can be a fisherman, tomorrow you can be, when communism is there, then everybody can I have the quote here, maybe I should read it. Okay, so he says, when communism is there, then you can go hunting in the morning, you can fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, and so on. So recently a friend of mine said, when communism is there, then we can do everything. If you like, you can do philosophy all day long, like this. And then I was wondering, does this make sense? If communism is there, in other words, if estrangement isn't there anymore, do we still need philosophy? does philosophy disappear in the moment when alienation disappears? I mean, as I said, just some associations in my head, maybe.
Thanks, Devor. Yeah, this is, so to the first question of the truth. I don't know that I'd want to put it in those terms of the truth, but it's clear that, Laruelle is the introduction of non-Marxism. As Jeremy said, it's a conjunctural book, but one of the elements of that conjuncture is that he wants to starts out by saying we have to, paraphrasing, we have to kind of admit certain historical failures of Marxism. At the same time, and that leads to the question, what then do we do with this material? But at the same time, he clearly, if we don't, perhaps not the term, maybe the term isn't truth, but he certainly also wants to affirm Marx's political orientation, as well as his effort, I think, where he thinks Marx is at his best, precisely when he is pushing against philosophical abstraction. And so those two things he certainly affirms. Now, is that a truth? I wouldn't want to conflate the concept of the truth with the concept of the real. In effect, even calling the real truth would be, maybe in Laruelle's terms, maybe ascribing too much to it. In effect, we can say that the real for him is the condition of possibility for thought. If it wasn't, thought is in the real. If the real wasn't, then thought wouldn't be either. But and so that is a kind of, I'd say it's an axiom that orients his entire thought, and it might function in his work as a kind of orienting truth, but I don't think that term might be at least in my view, the best one. But maybe it's an axiom of the real. And then the question is, how can we make philosophy in its presentation? How can we clone how can we make philosophy in its very presentation clone the reality of the real's already prior conditioning of that thought, rather than say, okay, now in this philosophical work, I'm going to tell you about the real and just frame it in a certain set of concepts and decisions. So an axiom, I think, would be, I'd be more comfortable with that term. The second question is very interesting too. If I understood you right, that, what about does philosophy estrange? Does it have an estranging function? And if...
No, it was the other way around. I mean, yeah, it can have an estranging function. I mean, I see that there is also a correlation, but I was asking more if philosophy only exists as long as there is estrangement.
Okay, as long as...
Maybe the simpler version, so to speak.
Right, I see. Yeah, I mean...
in other words, as I said, when you, for example, when communism is realized, there is no estrangement anymore. Do we still need philosophy?
Davor, we can't hear you.
When communism is realized, in other words, when we don't have any alienation or estrangement anymore, do we still need philosophy then?
Right. I mean, it's interesting in one might say that, philosophy, at least Marx's philosophy, certainly stems from, not from philosophy, but from a very real historical condition of domination by capital. And in that sense, maybe in some ideal sense, that philosophy might come to an end. As I think it was Lenin says something like, philosophy. I know Korsch quotes this quote, where it says, "Philosophy cannot be abolished without being realized." And the sense, I think the sense I think that's parallels that sense in certain moments that Marx suggests that if any philosophy is itself a product, in a sense, of a set of social and political conditions, then the change of those social and political conditions will itself give rise to a different kind of thought. So maybe one could say that a certain kind of philosophy would come to an end, historically become outmoded because of a change in social and political conditions. It will become a kind of something that one would study historically, but it wouldn't have kind of saliency with respect to the present. I mean, in Marx's own work, right, he's tarrying with, of course, Hegel and the young Hegelians more specifically, but always in the sense that, always his wanting to point out that the young Hegelians themselves, their thought is a kind of latter-day, watered-down product of the historical event of the bourgeois Enlightenment. That this is a kind of playing out. One would expect those kinds of philosophies to emerge given the social political space for thought at that moment. So maybe in that sense, a certain kind of philosophy would come to an end, or become philosophical, become outmoded, or merely of historical interest, with a radical change, communism. Especially if you think, the famed line out of the German ideology, we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present order. And so that meant, all of that goes, the socioeconomic conditions, but also the thought that is projected from that, and which in turn legitimates those conditions. I will say another thing on this point, though, which is, I think in Laruelle's own work, there's an attempt to estrange philosophical materials from philosophy by sort of canceling their decisional power. So in that sense, he actually, that's what I try to sort of use that concept of estrangement to say. I think that in Laruelle's work, he's actually trying to estrange philosophical material from philosophy as such. What does philosophical material, what can it do if it doesn't operate in terms of this kind of arrogation of intellectual power over, in a pseudo way, over the real? What then can it do? I think that's, in some measure, his project.
Any further comments? Last questions? Something you might want to add at the end, Jonathan?
To thank everyone for the invitation and for your great questions. And I see Katerina's comment here, estrangement is inescapable. I guess I'll leave that to think about, but thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a great talk. I hope that, this is a new area for many, especially for Marxists. So I hope we managed, and you, first of all, managed to kind of bring it closer to the readers that are not that familiar with Laruelle. So again, thank you so much for coming to the School of Materialist Research. I hope to see you here again. If that's it, then let's call it an evening. And yeah, thanks a lot. And
Thank you,
bye.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.